Today we're here with Post Capone. Post is a prolific poster. I guess that's actually pretty convenient naming there on Twitter, and also has like I would say some quite insightful takes on Bitcoin, and is one of the few I would say who's really in the weeds with MEV and pushing that discussion forward. So yeah, welcome, Post. If you want to give a little bit of background, like, you know, what you do or what you were doing, and we can go from there.
Hey, yeah, and thanks for having me on. I guess it's been kind of a while in the making. So yeah, my name's Post. I am a independent researcher and independent contractor working. I've been working in the sort of general blockchain space, basically full time since 2020. But I've had a lot of sort of exposure and interest in the space for a good while before that. I became really fascinated with like the kind of intricacies of consensus mechanisms and block producer incentives and block producer behaviors as MEV sort of unpacked and evolved in Ethereum. And I think, yeah, like there's clearly sort of a analogous evolution taking place in Bitcoin. It's super interesting. And I think it's also maybe a little bit more consequential than some people give it merit for being.
Yeah. You were quite, okay, so to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do feel as though you were pretty like crypto oriented for a long time. And it seems as though your focus is more on Bitcoin now. Is that directionally correct?
Yeah, I think like I've always maintained, there's records of me for years arguing with a lot of the ETH maxis about sort of the preeminence of Bitcoin as like, you know, the base unit of the market, and also sort of like the de facto security proxy for the entire market. I think that Bitcoin is foundational and has always been sort of home to me. But I did a lot of work in Ethereum. I did a lot of independent MEV searching, did some app contracting and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I think like I also similarly though, like I sort of despise the you're not allowed to touch things other than Bitcoin mentality that evolved amongst Bitcoin maxis.
Yeah.
It predates the block size war, but I feel like it became the meta during like 2017 era. And I think it's really dumb. And it promotes this like lack of awareness and understanding of what's going on in other networks, which is really unfortunate because like everything should be a Bitcoin testnet. Bitcoiners should be the smartest kids in the room, and we just aren't. You know, like that's not the case. But yeah,
yeah, and I think that is sort of also the inspiration for, you know, a lot of your most recent commentary on a lot of different stuff. But I've obviously noticed and wanted to talk specifically with you about OpCat. And I think what's interesting, I would say, about your perspective is that you're not someone who's, or like, again, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but my interpretation has been you're somebody who has been very open to the notion of changing Bitcoin, improving Bitcoin, adding, you know, functionality in whatever capacity. But you have had some reservations about OpCat, which is kind of interesting because I would say, you know, at least starting, call it a year and a half, 2 years ago, a lot of the people pushing for change were kind of rallying around this. It's a little bit maybe less so now. I think we can talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, you're somebody who is a little bit skeptical of OpCat. And I wanted to like maybe just start off with sort of getting your overarching view on why, you know, as somebody who isn't, you know, OSFI or in that camp, still has maybe some stronger reservations about OpCat than, you know, some of the other loud voices.
Yeah, I think that ossification as like a baseline position is pretty untenable. Like there's sort of clearly things that you need to do. So like the most obvious example, like from the Bitcoiner perspective, or like the layman Bitcoiner perspective, would be the soft forks that were activated to enable Lightning, right? Like we had to go through soft forks to get Lightning to where it is today. And I think that if you really look yourself in the mirror and say that Lightning is where it needs to be right now, like I don't even know what to tell you. You know, like there's clearly improvements that need to be made, even for the most sort of like Bitcoin adjusted directional paths like Lightning. Even if you don't, like, let's say you hate the idea of rollups or whatever, that's fine. But even just to improve the stack that we're currently working with, something has to give. There has to be things that get done. But I also I very much appreciate Bitcoin's conservatism. I think that the relationship that Bitcoin has had, especially with the extreme liberalism of other networks, has actually worked out as even as a great market placement, right? Like, you've got this very robust, rigid storm shelter asset, Bitcoin, and then you've got this very move fast, break things. Maybe it burns down, maybe it doesn't, Ethereum. You've got this sort of highly compromising and maybe to the extent of losing the plot, but who cares because no one really realizes it yet, thing like Solana. I think having those sort of qualifications as market assets is good. And I also think it allows Bitcoin, again, to sort of secure and prop up the rest of the market. I like these things. I enjoy the fact that Bitcoin's conservative. I think that, abandoning that on a whim, just without even getting into any technical minutia about anything, it just feels wrong. You know what I mean? Yeah. That being said, when people do propose specific things, you don't do it based on vibes or feelings. You got to look at what is it actually doing? What are the sort of systemic implications of the thing? And the high level opinion that I would have is that over the course of the past decade, we have watched these other networks mature and become, very economically relevant. And there's a lot of lessons that we can take from the pain points that they've experienced. And I think that we tend to look at the value capture in the application layer and be oh, look, here's the applications people want. We should do those applications on Bitcoin. And, I think thematically that's fine, but we also have to be willing to look at their failures and what their problems are. And I think one of the biggest pain points and borderline failures in other networks has been the erosion of censorship resistance via MEV. And we've seen it evolve across a couple of different pathways. The inroad consequences of MEV in Solana and Ethereum are pretty similar, but the actual path that they went along is different. And that's really informative because you have a couple of different evolutions to sort of consider. But all of this ultimately stems from this degree of expressivity they have, right? The thing that makes MEV so incredibly hard to deal with is that you don't really know what the MEV landscape looks like through a technical lens until you're in it, right? I don't really know what the applications people are going to make are like. I don't know how they're going to leak MEV. I don't know how to extract the MEV. I don't know the actual mechanisms at play until they've become economically relevant, are leaking the MEV, and a select set of block producers are extracting the MEV. And then it becomes kind of obvious. So I think that the advantage that Bitcoin has here, or at least one of the core advantages that Bitcoin has here, is that it's not very expressive. It's rather limited. You can sort of look at it and know okay, here are the MEV shaped things that people can do. And I think that when you get into talking about things like OpCat, you're sort of undermining that. You're implying such a vast range of opportunity for applications that you lose the ability to track what the MEV landscape is going to look like a year from now. And if you lose that, then you ultimately, what we've seen in Ethereum, for example, is we've seen specialists who manage to sort of edge their way into the R&D market for MEV, because in Ethereum, MEV had this very PvP, mempool PvP chapter, right? Where sandwich attacking wasn't necessarily something that block producers did. It was something that people in the mempool did. They just gamed the block construction algorithm with fee structures to create front running and back running transactions and extract value out of use of AMMs. And that sort of collapsed into specialists like Flashbots Beaver Build, et cetera, right? And where Flashbots and Beaver Build really like won the market is one, they like can pay a higher premium to the block producers than the mempool necessarily was willing to, just because the sort of shortness in the relationship. But two, they did a lot of R&D, and they were able to find like a couple more esoteric modes of MEV and like bundle those in and say, okay, well, if you do business with the mempool, you get like some fee premiums from the sandwich behavior. But if you do business with us, you get that plus some extra revenues from this like more esoteric modes of MEV that we've unpacked. And like, that's fine, whatever. You know, they built a integritous moat around their business, which is great, but it has this like really complicated effect on block producers, where even if you have a lot of block producers, you have as many as you want, really, you really only have one guy picking what transactions go into blocks. You have the MEV specialist selling these block templates. And the parallels there, so like in Bitcoin, we had the RBF sniping saga, right?
Yeah.
Where like the mode that people were swapping inscriptions with was exploitable to like reconstruct orders in the mempool. And that made this very mempool PvP era for Bitcoin MEV like stuff. And now we're seeing like private RPC popularity through Slipstream. It's nowhere near as like egregious or difficult to deal with as it was in Ethereum, but I don't know. It's interesting to me, the depth of similarities in the track as it evolves.
Yeah, that's fair. And so then was your conclusion, actually, I shouldn't say conclusion, was your thought, maybe at least now, or as you continue to do research, that Opcat specifically does introduce levels of expressivity that could mirror those in Ethereum? And maybe like if you wanted to, we did a panel, by the way, at Bitcoin Las Vegas. I don't know if that's uploaded on YouTube or not, but people can go watch that. But we kind of discussed like various forms of MEV that you suspect could or are currently occurring on Bitcoin. Like what are your sort of current concerns? And then would you say that your, the bulk of your concern is that, okay, we don't know how to, sort of analyze this in a vacuum yet, and as a result, like this is quite a risky, potential upgrade? Or is it that you have like very specific ideas in mind and we can sort of mirror already what you imagine could or will play out in Bitcoin?
Oh, I think you could 100% set up sort of the generics to demonstrate an extreme degree of expressivity from CAT. That's not a theoretic. I don't even really think that that's all that controversial of a claim. I don't know. It ebbs and flows a little bit. I feel like I'll go 3 months talking about this kinds of stuff with other people in like the Bitcoin space, and like it's completely non-controversial to say that the application space enabled by CAT is like extraordinarily large. And then all of a sudden you get 1 week where like everybody's like, no, it doesn't do that. It's like, what's going on? But the basic premise, and I don't know, we can unpack the details here for the audience if we need to, but CAT allows you to build up and verify hashes, right? So if I have the components that go into a pre-image, right? Like, so a Bitcoin transaction, right? The transaction hash of a Bitcoin transaction is a composite of all the little bits and pieces of a Bitcoin transaction, the input ID and the input amount and the output amount, and this, all this stuff, right? And if you can like put input amount, output amount, input ID, if you put all these components on the stack and then you concatenate them together in the right ways, if you build the structure of a Bitcoin transaction up correctly, you can hash these things together and wind up with the transaction hash, which you can then verify using the trick that Polstra explained in the Cat and Schnorr paper. And so now what you have is like, you have this program where I can put the input value on the stack, and then I can build the rest of the transaction around it, and then I can verify it using the Cat and Schnorr trick. And now I know I have a verifiable way to like introspect the input value, right? I can tell you what the input value of a transaction is from inside the script. And this is like really novel because you can't do introspection with script. It's like one of the sort of the famous limitations of Bitcoin script. Well, the same pattern, right? Building up a tree of components and finding a hash of them, if you think about like a Merkle tree, right? there's like a one hash that's a composite of two hashes, and each of those is a composite of two hashes. You can chain all these things together, build them up, and verify them. Well, the leaves of the Merkle tree can be the encodings of a function, and just like any function you want, really, right? Like I could tell you, it could be multiplication, it could be a bonding curve, it could be whatever the hell you want. And all I need to do is like have signatories in this protocol agree on like what the root hash of this function is. Like I just, these 32 bytes mean optimal, these 32 bytes mean bonding curve 2, whatever it is. And so the design space is like, I think it's fair to say that it's like practically infinite. There's some nuance there. Like you couldn't do very large output for like 256 bits mole. Like if you want to multiply very large numbers, like that's not going to work because you just can't compute the tree to do it. You never know what the root hash is. But for like if you wanted to do 32-bit mole, that's like totally tenable. Like you could absolutely get away with that. You could emulate 32-bit mole. You can emulate any sort of like similarly ranged function. And what that means is that basically you can take any component of a transaction, like you can pick apart a transaction, take a value from it, whether it's like the input or some information from the prevout or whatever, and you can apply whatever logic you want to them. You can like apply these like arbitrary state transitions. And that is like sort of the definition of expressivity. You can apply any many transformations to any given component of the transaction. And no, I don't think that you can have any kind of realistic conversation about what is or isn't possible in script from that point forward. The expressivity is like for all realistic means, it's infinite. Now what you can say, and often does come up, is you can be like, well, it's just like way too expensive to do this stuff. Like these are all like incredibly inefficient way. Like you're talking about using at best, like 1,000 to 1,500 kilobytes for some arbitrary 32-bit function, right? And that's a lot, especially if the function was natively supported in script, it would be 68 bytes or something like this, right? So it becomes now a conversation about like the economic viability of a script. It's like who's actually going to pay to use this, right? Surely it's not going to be some guy swapping $100 or $10 in a DEX for some kind of shitcoin. It's going to have to be something with a lot more demand for that. And I think those applications exist, right? Like I think you could imagine any number of like cross-chain messaging protocols for like different roll-up or layer 2 solutions to sort of pass messages or values back and forth between one another. You could imagine like a USDT mint or redeem function, like on-chain mint or redeem function. You can imagine something like that. All those are like things that could have enormous amounts of value transferred in them, and they could consider the sort of relative block space purchase to be kind of insignificant, or like the trade-off is worth it, right? Like it's worth it for them to have this like trustless feature or this integrated feature for Bitcoin. And they buy it. So, okay, what do those things leak? What do those things look like? What do people actually build? How do they use them? Do they leak MEV? But then also there's like this second order thing. And again, this is like one of those non-controversial things in CAT that I think the implications just don't really get brought up. So CAT sort of necessarily implies that, okay, people are going to do these like weird, janky emulations of other functions. That's going to buy a bunch of block space. Well, in a year, 10, 15, 20% of block space is being bought by these crazy CAT monstrosities for Tether and rollups and whatever. You're gonna start to discuss with yourself, like, maybe we should just activate opmol. Maybe we should just give them a, whatever the function is that they're using. Whatever the thing people are doing is, you're going to want to optimize for that behavior just to like stop the egregious block purchasing. Like there's no need for it. And that precipitates making the applications that use those things cheaper, which then lowers this like threshold of who uses it. And so you're kind of constantly driving towards more and more accessibility of more and more expressive scripts that leak more and more MEV. And I don't know that it's like really good to say that like we can keep up with this as like modes of MEV. I think there's a very real possibility that you sort of fall victim to the same sort of MEV specialization trap where block producers don't have their own like capacity to extract this MEV. They have to go to a specialist, and that specialist winds up pulling off this template capture thing, which just entrenches this like mining centralization problem that Bitcoin's very concerned with.
Yeah. Okay. But let me ask you, maybe take some of the counter arguments or take the other side for a second. And I talked about this in this panel with you. One, so there's a few things that people bring up, right? Like block times and probabilistic finality and like just like little things, the UTXO model, right? These are little things that people bring up that, you know, suggest, okay, well, this is quite unlikely to occur on the Bitcoin L1. But like, let's put those aside for a second, because I think your point can still be true in the sense that, well, it enables it and we don't know yet. So that's fair. Let me ask you though, one of the stronger counter arguments I hear, and again, I'm not saying this is my opinion nor this is necessarily the case, but one of the counter arguments is OpCat enables the ability to create layer 2s that would capture the execution and a lot of the areas where MEV leaks the most. And so it may be worthwhile to activate something like OpCat such that these L2s aren't incentivized to, you know, use the like limited scripting abilities of the L1 as, you know, this like pure play execution layer. Do you find this to be a compelling argument or no?
I think it's a pretty reasonable argument, and I think it's worth beating around. So like the premise is the just to simplify it, the degens don't use the L1 because they can just go use the L2. Right? Like, okay, maybe there is a bunch of,
or like, yeah. Okay, we can put this more in the context of something that's like trying to be built right now. ZK rollups. You know, one of the claims there as well. OpCat can enable much more functional ZK rollups. As a result, all of this activity that we're petrified about, all of this execution can go to these ZK rollups, which, as you were discussing before, are kind of functionally applications, and then we can let the applications deal with the MEV. So yeah, I would say like roughly, but I'm now giving like an actual, you know, hard example.
Sure.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, I guess like why was there $700 million in block space buying pressure from these meta protocols when Solana exists? Right. And it also we treat it as a ratio argument. Oh, well, 99% of the business will go to the L2, maybe 1% will be on the L1. This doesn't really work either. I don't care what the ratio between the L1 and the L2 are. I care about what the ratio between the L1 capturable MEV and the block producer's sort of like sensitivity to fees is, right? Yeah. Like there's some number that the block producers have, like maybe they know what the number is, maybe they don't, but there's a number that the block producers have where like if there's more money than that on the table, then they change what they're doing. They go chase the money, right? Yeah. And it doesn't, like I said, there could be quadrillions of dollars going on in the L2. It wouldn't change the fact that the number on the L1 is big enough to change the block producer behavior. And I think that's what really matters. So again, I think it's a good argument, and I think it's worth beating around. I'm not trying to be completely dismissive of it. I just think that the way that we discuss it is like not really in tune with what actually matters, which is again that relationship between the MEV on the L1 and the block producer behaviors.
The Gwart Show is sponsored by Ellipsis Labs, who I've been following for 3 years now. They are one of the strongest teams I know in crypto. Ellipsis Labs is a small engineering team with a flat structure. They build complex systems, primarily in Rust. For engineers who like challenges, here's the kind of problem they solve. A layer 2 blockchain needs to maintain 100 million accounts and generate a state root after each transaction batch. The root must be built within 50 milliseconds. How would you design the system to ensure the root construction is fast enough? High-performance challenges are core to Ellipsis Labs' mission as they build modern crypto finance. They believe finance needs more than an upgrade. It needs a complete rewrite. The success of their first product, Phoenix V1, speaks for itself, doing over $70 billion in organic trading volume. Now, Ellipsis Labs is building Atlas, the blockchain purpose-built for verifiable finance. I know this team personally, and I like them because they're unique in the crypto space. They have a long-term focus, they work in person from their New York City headquarters, and they're here to build products that fundamentally change the world of finance. If you want to learn more about their open roles, go to ellipsislabs.xyz/careers.
Okay, let's just zoom out a little bit, or discuss other things that are adjacent. So we talked about how, I think my initial preface was that, a couple years ago, I don't know how long ago it was now, but maybe a little while ago, there was this effort, let's upgrade Bitcoin. And then it did seem for a while that people were rallying around OpCat. That doesn't feel to be quite the case anymore. Would you generally agree?
Yeah, I had kind of a really brief conversation with Udi while we were in Vegas, and I asked him, or Udi, sorry, I'll say his name.
I was laughing.
He unblocked me, so I'll say his name right now. No, I just have called him that for so long. It's really not, it's not deliberate. But in any case, I was talking to him very briefly in Vegas, and I was like, so what, would you give Cat better odds now than a year ago? And his answer was, no, I think I would give it worse odds than a year ago, but I would give it better odds than a couple of months ago. And I think I agree with him on this. I think I agree with him sort of in line with the entire covenants thing, because there's a reality where all the op return drama and stuff like this that's gone on, sobriety resolves in this sort of realization that covenants have a lot to do with this problem. And I think it's still a little bit of a matter of time before the general public discourse comes to that sobriety, but I think it does happen, and that'll be an opportunity for covenants to be discussed again. I mean, we already saw the letter from James O'Brien and a lot of the other application and protocol engineers supporting CTV and trying to address it as a focal point. I think CTV has much better odds than Cat. There was a time where I kind of had been convinced that maybe it was more of a split odds scenario, but I think that for a number some people, if you take the Cat pill and you have the Cat conversation, you kind of wind up admitting to yourself that activating Cat is dumb, because if you're going to activate Cat, you should just activate all the other things. Right. You should just jump full bore into it. And so that then loses ground to simplicity, for example. And now you're debating whether or not we should just wait on simplicity. That loses ground to, okay, a omnibus package where you do Cat and mul and a bunch of other generic scripting primitive type stuff. And I think CTV is helpful here. Even if there is, okay, so take my argument about the sort of modes of MEV, teaching block producers how to extract MEV, and then unleashing MEV after you can sort of educate them on what it is, right? There's a theoretical world there where you get really good at that pipeline, and then you no longer really care about Cat or mul or whatever. You've just sort of gotten the cadence up. That's a very theoretical outcome, to be clear. I don't think it's super likely in sort of the set of odds, but that could exist. CTV is this great step where you're okay, and especially CTV plus check sig from stack. There are MEV modes that get exposed from that. There's just very few of them, and we can look at it and we can tell what they are. And so I think that's it's a great way to loosen the training wheels for Bitcoin on this issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's generally what I've at least inferred as well, kind of reading up on this. I want to ask you then, what do you want to see on Bitcoin? And we'll start with just the very broad, subjective, what do you want to see built? And maybe you could take this from a personal level too, that doesn't exist right now.
I really think just improve. I as cliche or meme worthy as it might be, I think that at the end of the day, improving the P2P payments use case is the end game, right?
Yeah, I agree.
But there is this thing. So I'll borrow an argument from Rendale, which I actually think is a great coherent argument, right? In order to actually improve the peer-to-peer payment use case, you have to get people receiving Bitcoin. You have to get merchants that want Bitcoin. And right now, the easiest to onboard merchants to receive Bitcoin are these dumb shitcoin protocols. Those are the people who want to receive things. They want to stand up websites that have the buttons on them for people to do this stuff. And so that's like basically the test bed where a lot of this stuff gets developed that you then can go to other sort of like real bona fide merchants and be like, look, we built this software. It's traded this much in value. There's this many merchants that support it. Sure, there are a bunch of really silly nonsense merchants, but they're merchants and they settle the value and like nothing's broken yet. And so I think that like giving breathing space to the application layer and letting people have a little bit of fun is good. Like it's the flywheel into the technology stack that gives you this payments use case, the actual like meat and potatoes of what you need for legitimate payments use cases. So yeah, like I think that whatever people have in mind and whatever sort of creativity people want and what people respond to is great. I don't think that so Udi might say like, oh, look at the billions of dollars from this or that application on Ethereum. Bitcoin should want that. I don't want to exclude anybody from markets and like, take away from the ability to get out there and earn it. But I don't think Bitcoin as a protocol is at all as in any way like beholden to service some sort of like theoretical demand just by looking at another network,
Well, I think this is an interesting point, and I do wonder, like, I agree with you at least directionally on this, and I kind of wonder if this is not like to put ourselves in some enlightened category here, but I do wonder if this is as a like somewhat a function of us having paid attention to a lot of the rest of crypto. Like, I don't have very strong feelings. Well, I should qualify this by saying that I oftentimes defer, especially in Bitcoin, I defer to people who I think have spent a lot of time in Bitcoin and who understand it very well. But I then formulate my own opinions. And one of those is that, and again, I'm kind of curious if you feel similarly as a result of looking at other, protocols in crypto writ large, it's not necessarily my belief that everything must be on Bitcoin, right? Like, I don't have strong feelings that stablecoins must come to Bitcoin or must exist on a layer that ultimately pays Bitcoin miners. That's like, that's not something that I hold deep down as a truth in the world,
It might even be a preference the other direction.
Right. I lean toward it being a preference in the other direction, right? And so it is kind of a little bit like paradoxical there, right? Where like for a long time people have thought, oh, everything's a Bitcoin testnet. I'm like, why can't it just be like its own thing? We can have like, I'm not a multi-chain maxi, but I'm a multi-chain like do whatever, right? Like if Solana's really good for sending USDC around the world, like why are we screeching about this needing to be on Bitcoin,
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's a time horizons thing, but I think that eventually what you figure out is like Solana doesn't need to be a blockchain, right? Like,
yeah,
there's
I know what you're saying, but yeah, go ahead.
I don't mind that Solana is a blockchain. Like they can be whatever it is they want to be, but I think that ultimately what you figure out is that like there's cryptographic primitives and tools that we use inside of blockchains that are like really empowering to stuff like stablecoins, and they should totally use those. But the actual rails for the stablecoin certainly doesn't need to be on Bitcoin. It probably doesn't even need to be on Solana. I agree. Like,
but I think it's lost upon a lot of people, right? Like, because I think that the notion is, well, this exists on a blockchain, therefore that is its most viable medium. When in reality, it's like the permissionless to receive, permissionless to send, being able to self-custody in some capacity. Those don't necessitate like a widely distributed, nodes around the world updating every single transaction that you send to buy groceries or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. I don't even know. I don't even know that the permissionless to receive thing, or specifically permissionless to send thing, necessarily works with stablecoins. Like maybe it works in algorithmic stablecoins or something like that, but those have a bunch of their own problems. So
yeah, I mean, I think I've come around. I don't know. I go back and forth on this personally, but like I've come around to the notion that okay, look, there is some degree of decentralization. You may argue it's more on the centralized side, and I don't know where I fall on this, but like there's something about Solana's distributedness that provides some security to people sending stable coins around. Now, you and I can both sit here and say at the end of the day, Circle and Tether can scratch your name out of their database. So like when you have a persistent natural counterparty, it does greatly reduce the need for, again, a distributed set of nodes around the world. You and I can agree to that, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, it's happening now, so there's something to it, but maybe I can't necessarily put my finger on it.
Yeah, there's I feel like this was an old Degen Spartan rant, but I don't remember who it actually was. But there was a saga on crypto Twitter at one point in time where people were, really, it was in the sort of like real stablecoin boom of like last cycle, but they were arguing like what's the real point of stablecoins, and where it kind of eventually came to was like the yield on stablecoins is the premium for offshore illicit funds. Like that's basically what this is. And so like to your point, it like there even seems to be kind of a discernible market reality where the permissionlessness is respected even if it doesn't technically exist, or something like that.
It is. I will say that especially like the last 6 months, right, there's a new stablecoin boom, as you've noticed, but especially the last 6 months, it's, I would say, right, like let's say for a second we're both putting our ideological hats on, right? I think we put on many hats, but let's say we're putting our ideological hats on. I think it's kind of jading the degree to which stablecoins are being pushed as the like final in-game use case. Like, and to the extent that I'm hearing VC, like well-respected, I won't name names here, but like I'm hearing well-respected, thought leaders, if you will, in the community going on, podcasts and podcasts outside of our kind of crypto sphere. And they're talking about how there's Bitcoin and then there's stable coins, and there's not much discussion about the in-between. And maybe you and I have a lot of reservations about the in-between, right? And like how practical or useful it is, but it's still almost bizarre at this point how much of like an agreement that, well, we figured it out. It's rails for stable coins.
Yeah, I've been hearing this a lot, especially in the last several months. Yeah. I don't really think they're wrong in
I don't either. I don't
certain
either.
contexts. Yeah. So like so the pump fun meta for Solana, right? Like everything is denominated in SOL. You're like stuffing a bunch of SOL into these LPs. Like this is like from a pure market dynamics perspective, this is all like sort of a good SOL, right? Solana gets a bunch of network fees. There's a bunch of SOL in LPs, blah, blah, blah.
Like velocity sinks.
Yeah, right. So Trump launched his stablecoin and he put like almost, I don't want to go into, I don't want to call specific numbers here because I could very easily be wrong. But if I remember correctly, he put like most of the LP in USDC, and it was like, well, rip, there it goes. Like if everybody does that, then like that's game over, bro. Like you're just a stablecoin network. Like that's all you are. And like those things are, I think they're like kind of likely outcomes. I think that a lot of the people trading these assets, they care about, did they make enough to afford their McDonald's for the night or whatever. And yeah, they're treating it all as USDC denominated assets. I think all that's like really unfortunate. I think bringing back, I was joking on Twitter about this actually yesterday, like make /BTC great again, like denominate everything in Bitcoin again, but it's just not going to happen. Like we're past that point. But I think that as far as like what gets built on Bitcoin, So I'll say this on the stablecoins point, and I think you and I have discussed this some. I don't really so much care if stablecoins are on Bitcoin or not, and also like you can't really stop it, so you better not care too terribly much. At least from a like maybe you care about your predictions for what happens to Bitcoin, but you don't get too morally wrapped up in it. But the real problem is in like programmatic lending contracts. That's like, so when we go back to the expressivity of script, right? Like I think one of the things that you really actually kind of want to lean away from, at least until you've figured out some things, is the ability for people to write programmatic lending, which is one of the first things people do with Expressivity, by the way. Like that's like, especially non-interactive lending, like that's the really big one that everybody wants, is like non-interactive programmatic lending protocols. That's like, I think if you broke down the actual amount of like value in high expressivity contracts, like you would see a lot, you could map a lot of it to that. And those have like really complicated implications for fork chain selection dynamics. Like if you ever have a contentious fork, whoever controls the assets that are being credited out of these lending contracts, like they're a very difficult influence to break in that chain selection.
Hey, Will here with Blockspace Media. Did you know that we have individual feeds for all our shows? If you're watching the Mining Pod, Bitcoin Season 2, or the Gwart Show, be sure to check out the individual feeds. You can find them on your podcast player of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Just type in Blockspace Media and you'll find all our shows pop up, or just type in the individual show name like the Mining Pod or Bitcoin Season 2. Be sure to hit that subscribe and give us a 5-star rating so we can continue to bring you the best content in Bitcoin.
Okay, so I want to pivot a little bit to just like some of the scaling solutions that are in the works, or maybe people are talking about. Have you been following Arc, Spark? Can you like maybe give us your personal thoughts on, like how Arc, what your thoughts are on Arc, and then Spark and state chains in general? I don't know. I think you probably have more knowledge than I do, so I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I think both are great. I think BitVM is great. I think Arc is great. I think state chains are pretty darn good. There's I think that for a lot of the so anything that's like kind of an ephemeral experience for the user, I think state chains are absolutely wonderful for. Like if you were running like a little gambling casino, or if you're just trading shitcoins or whatever, like these things that last for like, weeks or months at best, like these are like really great applications for state chains. Spark is going after the stablecoins route. And there's a number of ways you can sort of like mitigate this ephemeral thing, or at least they advertise they're going after I'm not really sure. Like the Spark's marketing is very focused on stablecoins.
Yeah.
And I'll say this: if you're gonna do this stuff with stablecoins, right? Like if you want to have stablecoins on Bitcoin, but you don't want to expose a lot of this like programmatic lending risk and stuff like that, putting them off into a little state chain thingy is like not the worst solution. It doesn't solve every single problem, but it's like a pretty good way to do it. And stable coins, as we were mentioning earlier, like these are kind of administrative assets. Like there is an administrative surface there. You just have an ambivalent administrator. That's kind of exactly what a state chain is. And so like the actual product fits the like trust trade-offs, I guess, of state chains. And so I think it's like really, really applicable. I think it's very cool that Magic Eden partnered with Spark. I think it's been kind of a long time coming to see inscriptions, runes, all this stuff move into state chain layers. In a different life, I probably would have like actually sort of pushed that stack myself and been like, hey guys, you should use this. But yeah, I think all that's good. Arc, like I'm excited to see what people actually do with it. Like I know Alex is doing arcade. I think that like the arcade initiative is very cool, and he's taking it more from kind of the base protocol team, and then like creating, as far as I understand it anyway, it's kind of creating a stack for other people to go out and do stuff with. As far as I'm aware, we sort of are like yet to see what people are doing with it. Although I am really excited to see what people do with it. And I think that similar things to the, like what we were just talking about with the state chains exist, like putting a lot of this high expressivity stuff in Arc would be fine. Like maybe so one, I think the way they have Arc set up is, you really only have one Arc coordinator operator. But like in theory, let's say that people are really silly and they want decentralized Arc, or something like this. And then a bunch of MEV happens, and like the MEV erodes the censorship resistance in the ARC. Who cares? You know, I just don't like it. It's fine. I think it's great to run those experiments off in those execution environments. BitVM is kind of like maybe a little bit more interesting. We've gotten to this point now, and we will eventually get to this point with ARC as well. But we have like 4 or 5 like very distinct branches in BitVM development, where like the term BitVM is now referring to like this core piece of technology that 5 very distinct technologies are using. And so like saying Citria is BitVM or the Babylon thing is BitVM or whatever, like it's not really a great way to package it. One way to look at that is I'll bring up, there's a Corallo post this morning saying the point that I think a lot of us wish could have gotten across years ago, which is in the op return drama and the whole filter wars nonsense, this should be consensus proposals, right? Like you really can't use standardness this way. It's really dangerous. You shouldn't do this. But if you want to make consensus proposals, that's fine. The thing that he brought up was like the max transaction weight, like the largest transaction. He was like, if you wanted to so like in standardness, like in the relay layer, you can't relay something effectively greater than 400,000 weight units, but you can go in a block. You can do a 4-megger. You can fill a whole block with a single transaction. So Matt was like, hey, if you guys wanted to propose like pulling the max transaction weight down in consensus, like there's actually some upside to that. Like it simplifies, the bandwidth constraints on relays. It makes blocks cheaper to validate. It helps with mining pool software. Like there's a bunch of upside to that. There's also a bunch of downside. There's like, I'm sure that'll get heavily debated. One of the downsides would be that like in some of the modern BitVM implementations, some of the transactions are very, very large, like almost a full block. And so that could get negatively affected. I kind of am in a seat right now where I think that it's not unlikely that there becomes these kind of soft fork constraint scenarios as like sort of the final resolution to this whole standardness debate thing. Which would have a disproportionate amount of effect on BitVM than it does on the other technologies. And so I guess I'm kind of curious to see what that does. At the end of the day, they can fall back to like I was saying, there's like branching implementations of BitVM. Like the guys that are using these particularly big transactions in their sort of the unrolling of their proofs, they can just fall back to other iterations of the technology. But there's some texture there, I guess.
Yeah. Do you feel like, so just give me your personal view on this. We have all these scaling solutions coming to market or allegedly coming to market in the next 1-2 years with, various designs, and we've just discussed. Do you feel that Bitcoiners have been reluctant to use systems on the grounds that they don't feel they're secure, or like it's a multi-sig or something, and that these new solutions are going to provide, that demand? Like, do you think there's a lot of latent? I guess what I'm wondering is like, there's oftentimes this argument, well, there's a ton of latent demand to use Bitcoin and stuff, and then, you go back to a lot of these other side chains and L2s, and they have like very different trust trade-offs and stuff, but in reality, like, Ethereum and Solana have become de facto Bitcoin layer 2s for certain, people. Do you think that this is going to be like the impetus for people to really, start using it? Or is that kind of like a fallacy, that the main reason is because of, the designs have not been there?
I think that the biggest motivating factor behind a lot of scaling solutions is the opportunity to tokenize them. So I think scaling solutions are great, and I think we need to find use for them. And sometimes they do get use, right? So like the contrast scenario that I would provide would be like Blast versus Base, right? And Base is a lot of like, sort of real endogenous use, and it's kind of cyclical. It's not like the most used thing in town every day, but like it has users, it does business. You know, did Blast last a year? I'm not sure what the actual.
I mean, it depends on how you define last, but yeah, right. I would argue no.
Yeah. But there was a lot of VC interest in Blast. Everybody wanted, you know, like there's a lot of gamification there. So I think that you probably see the same thing in Bitcoin, right? Like I think you see a lot of either naive or extractive kind of VC plays. They oversell themselves or others on technologies that aren't really finding a fit. And it's a pure token warrants volatility play. It's not really like a serious like application bid. But I think there are very real applications. Like I think that, you know, even if you had like sort of like a runes app chain kind of, you know, nonsense thing, like that would probably see quite a bit of use for a while.
Yeah, but like what about like so there have been some of these, right? Like what is this, Oden.fun, right?
Is Oden.fun really a thing yet? Like
or was it a thing? And I don't know. I mean, it uses like ICP on the back or whatever. Yeah, ICP on the back end. But I'm just giving like that is something, right? That made the trading experience for, was it runes like better?
Well, I don't know. Like, I mean, it's kind of a serious question. Like right now, Bob is doing a lot of like sort of ramp up promo to like what Oden will be. And so like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if we have a really good view into that yet. I can tell you that like from having talked to some of the like, you know, movers and shakers and a couple of like the runes assets that haven't just like completely died out, there's some interest there. Like they're not completely ignoring it. I really don't know. Like we'll see. But I could, and also I think that there's another space, right, where you can, like we memed a lot in late 2022, early 2023 about like, we really need the crypto apps that nobody realizes are crypto apps kind of thing. There's a lot of space for that as well, right? And I think that especially if you have the Bitcoin denominated or solely stablecoin denominated approach there, you could pretty easily see like legitimate new users onboarded into the ecosystem just by like getting viable technology to work with like general web experiences in Bitcoin. So I'll say it this way: if the capital constraints and then the UX for Lightning were not just absolutely dog shit, then I think that you would see a lot of Lightning integration in the web, just like casual day-to-day Lightning integration. Like your Shopify's would have Lightning payments and stuff. So I think that if you can sell people kind of generically on the idea that this is built on Bitcoin, even if there's a bunch of trust trade-offs, even if there's a bunch of this stuff, like there's a real market for that stuff. I think people do want it, and I think there's a lot of stuff out there where like people would love crypto integration, but they don't want the this summer's theme crypto integration, right? They don't want to change what they're wiring into every 18 months. They want a stack that works. But again, back to Rendale's point, we kind of have to prove that it works, right? Like in order to demonstrate to these merchants that there's something real here and it's valuable and it's secure and it's reliable, we have to like put it through the runner a little bit. And right now, the people that are willing to put it through the runner are the degens.
Yeah, I think that's oftentimes been the kind of chicken or the egg scenario with Bitcoin, where Bitcoiners are very adamant that they want, you know, proven viable use cases before making either changes to consensus or just more realistically, you know, putting a lot of investment or community effort behind applications or, you know, scaling solutions. But then the problem is that a lot of these applications and layers are constrained. So there's kind of like, you want proven product market fit, but you can't really put it into production capability on the grounds that, well, the final version is not going to look like this if we got something like, I don't know, OpCat, right? So like that's been the like trade-off. And we collectively have been able to observe the rest of crypto, but I mean, you could make, this is like part of why I take a little bit more of, I don't know, measured sounds more self-important than it is. But like, I just kind of take a let's wait and see approach, because I mean, you could argue that rollups are, you know, the end all be all scaling solution. And then you could look at Ethereum and, well, like, have rollups been successful? I think you would get, you know, very strong opposing sides on something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll add, do you think rollups have been successful on Ethereum?
No, not really.
Yeah. So this is like the hesitancy with the BitVM thing for me, is I think that, and it does also kind of play into the ARC scenario as well, although it might be a little more solvable. Like the solve might be more elegant for ARC. I think like chasing the rollup model does. So, okay, let's go all the way back to like kind of towards the beginning of the conversation when we were talking about, like, we see all this great like economic activity on these other chains. We get very jealous of it, but then we don't ask ourselves about the failures, right? Like we forget to, as Bitcoin is just like really bad about discussing the actual failures, not the tinfoil deranged Bitcoin Maxi scam failures, but like the actual material failures, right? One of the material failures of the rollup model is you know, the liquidity fragmentation, the segregation of all these different ecosystems, the general economic impact of it on the L1. Like there's a lot of like interesting problems there that are like definitely worth paying attention to. And while I love the BitVM technology stack, I just wonder whether or not these sort of applications that are on the other side of BitVM are really like gonna give us what we sometimes might convince ourselves that they will. I think that it's fairly probable that evolves more similarly to rollups on Ethereum, which I would say rollups on Ethereum have had success, but they are losing to sort of like the monolithic blockchain, the soul kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but I also think that maybe a slightly different point that I would make is like, I think there was a lot of belief in, well, you know, there's these different stages of rollups, and you want to get to this, you know, effectively completely trustless ZK rollup. And well, what really has taken off in terms of rollups? Well, Base, right? And Base is probably the most I don't know, I'll probably get castigated for this, but it's probably the most centralized of the rollups, right? So and a lot of the like maybe the demand is like, I think you made this point a while ago, right? Like with regards to optimistic rollups, and then some of what optimistic rollups enable versus ZK rollups. Like you kind of made this argument, which I'd never really thought of it like this at the time, which is, you know, if you have the ability to sort of, you know, on a rollup reverse or, you know, change a transaction if there's fraud or crime or whatever, like that may be where the demand actually is, right? But one can think of this in the long, at least in practice right now, as being like, well, Base has the most users of any rollup, I'm fairly confident, right? And it's probably the most trusted, and so it kind of makes me think like, well, where are the users really going, right? It's sort of this stated versus revealed preferences thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really prudent point. So basically, there's very, very few implementations of rollups in Ethereum that don't have some kind of ability to push an arbitrary state update, like if they really needed to. And I mean, like at the end of the day, you kind of have to give them a break, right? Like if they screwed up and did something wrong, they would rather be able to push an arbitrary state update to fix it than like burn billions of dollars, right? So like, sure, whatever. And I think I know exactly what you're referring to, the conversation from a while back. But basically the argument goes, you know, like what percentage of cash is actually like paper cash in people's wallet? What percentage of gold is in self-custody? People don't really want self-custody, like broadly, globally speaking, right? Like, of course, we're crypto nut jobs, we want it, whatever. But like, you'd think like gold in particular is really interesting, because you think with gold, part of the premise of gold is like the apocalypse asset. Well, it's not a very good apocalypse asset if it's not in your custody. So like, what percentage of gold is actually in custody, or what percentage is just like IOUs on an exchange ledger? And you know, the answer is the vast majority of it is IOUs. And I think that that's like sort of a premise in rollups, is like that people do want that. I think you're right. I'll note that like part of the way I was framing that then, and I'll stand by this now, is like that's kind of a problem for Ethereum, because the the deposited ETH there, like that's capital and collateral for the rollup provider to become a more and more weightier participant in consensus, right? Yeah. So because there's like this direct connection between block production and this sort of depository behavior to the rollup, you have this reality where like that rollup becomes an authority of the chain. Or, Coinbase is already a massive authority of the chain, but it just sort of like entrenches their role there. And I also like, this might kind of apply to Bitcoin. I'd have to think it through a little bit, I guess. But there's a lot of like weird economic realities when the value in the rollup is like really, really big compared to the value of the base layer. Like just the political
the proportion,
Yeah, right. So, eCash in Bitcoin might be one way to think about this. That might be like accessible to a lot of Bitcoin people. You don't really want one eCash map, because then like everybody's trusting the same guy not to screw you over. You want to distribute it out across a bunch of eCash mints as best you can anyway. There's a little bit of the same dynamic. It doesn't map 1-to-1. It's not the same, but there's a little bit of the same dynamic with rollups. You want like a competitive market for these rollup execution environments, which, for what it is, I think that we're seeing that kind of evolve. Like there's not one like absolute. There's not one just like head and shoulders like this person's going to wreck the whole BitVM rollup market. Like nobody else is going to be even like 1% as relevant or whatever. There's good competition.
Yeah. And I think the argument maybe for the Bitcoin rollups, which is I think valid, is that it doesn't compete with the base layer really for Expressivity 1. I'm talking about like the to be clear, I'm talking about kind of the rationale for these being successful. It doesn't compete with the base layer for the expressivity, so that's a benefit. And then Bitcoin, the asset, being more desirable perhaps, whereas elsewhere you may see more of an integration with stables and various other assets, or wrap Bitcoin for that matter. So it does, I mean, it makes sense. I guess we'll wait and see, but I have wondered, to what degree do we learn from Ethereum and rollups and make any judgments with regards to Bitcoin, or do we just sort of make the arguments that I just made, which is that, well, this is like a completely different asset altogether, and it has different limitations on the base layer, and so that's sufficient enough for it to be kind of a viable market demand.
I think that when you're talking about the really high expressivity stuff, you're going to wind up with these bridge interfaces one way or another. And so it's going to be like BitVM-like regardless. However, I'll throw in there that you could do like simple constrained covenants, shout out CTV. You can do really elegant solutions for scaling that don't really imply so there's like a really simple sort of like description of it, like if you're in a CTV tree, right? Like if you're in one of these VUTXOs, you're in a shared UTXO construct, moving from one of those to another is really just a matter of two signing servers sort of like telling each other what's going on. Like, hey, in my next CTV update, my next branch, I'm going to trade out Alice from my tree into your tree, right? And this is like really, and the reliability of this and the way it like resolves the base layer is sort of built into the tree mechanism itself. Whereas with rollups, you have to have like you can move people from one rollup to another, but there's a lot of like sort of weird middleware there or custodial LPs that facilitate it. And ultimately, you need to have some kind of cross-chain communication protocol where these batch and resolve between each other. So there's like, you have to eventually like pull this message across the base layer, which is another like back, when we were talking about the OpCat MEV things. Like I think that if you see a really robust BitVM market, you necessarily wind up seeing a cross-chain, an XCM market, a cross-chain messaging protocol. that probably uses cat and probably does a bunch of weird stuff with cat and creates this demand for more efficient opcodes. That's like that directional component of activating things after cat. Whereas with constrained covenants, like, well, you don't get the complete expressivity solution, but you could optimize BitVM. Like you could get solid optimizations of BitVM. So why don't we get the simple, elegant, non-complicated, non-fragmenting solutions out of constrained covenants, and like BitVM can use them to like improve itself a little bit, and BitVM can just be the bridge to like the weird expressivity layer. It can do its thing. I don't know. That just all seems much more sensible to me.
Yeah, no, it seems sensible to me as well. Well, I think it's been fantastic. Did we leave anything out?
No, I've enjoyed the conversation, man. It's been good. Okay,
well, awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. And you're doing, well, first of all, where can people find you on Twitter?
On Twitter, it's Post Capone. The name's all janky, all the vowels are numbers. But if you just search Post Capone, it'll come up.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
And then I'll have you back on when you've done a whole breakdown of research on cat and MEV, and you can give us your final conclusion and present in front of the audience then.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to subject that to a lot of kind of peer review process, I guess, and refine it out. But yeah, I would love to, once there's like a nice package consolidated take on like how to actually quantify a lot of these points. We should totally do it again.